In this episode, I will teach you about the most useful pattern you can use to design your own e-learning scenarios.
You're here because you want more engagement, more delight, more fun, more learning. You're hungry for change and willing to take action.
If you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original.
Welcome to the eLearning Scenario Design Podcast with Anna Sabramowitz.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
Let's take learning to the next level.
Hello and welcome back, my friend. How are you today? My name is Anna Sabramowitz, as you probably heard in the intro. And let's just talk about something that I think is very important for you to master and very important for you to apply. I'm going to teach you today about the most useful scenario design pattern out there, framework out there, which is called the multiple choice question. It sounds simple, but to master this, there's very few people out there that have done this, and I urge you to make this a part of your toolkit, your repertoire, and get solid at this skill, because once you've got it down, all of those issues that you have with some of those things that people write me about will actually disappear. And let me just first talk about some of those challenges. So, and I have some really great quotes from these really great resources that I have that have been sitting on my shelf, and I've been using them forever as kind of my guidance. They were the foundation for a lot of this, the thinking that I've done over the past basically 15 years doing this kind of work. So one of the things that designers usually get in touch with me with is, how do you get over the overwhelm of when you start a new project? How are you going to design it? And a lot of the other questions that come up are that, you have limited time with the subject matter expert, and then all of a sudden when you talk to them, you actually realize that the information that you're getting from them is not exactly what you need to actually produce something really great as far as a scenario goes, right? You've decided that you are going ahead with the scenario design thing. You identified the skills that need to be practiced, but then when it comes down to talking to the SME, the stuff they give you, you have no clue how to put that into a scenario because it's not what you need. It's not the kind of information that you need to make a really credible scenario happen. And the other piece that is usually quite frustrating as well, and this comes up everywhere, is you're dumped with a giant folder of things and you're told, hey, can we turn this into scenarios? And that's also very overwhelming because you don't know where to start, right? You don't know what you can do to actually create something that people won't hate and try to poke their eyes out with pencils once they're through. You want to create things that are engaging, people find them useful, and also that you're proud of, right? Like people are proud of the work that they're doing, and they're saying, hey, I've made some impact, or people really found that useful, and I'm noticing they're completing this learning, they're interested, they're taking it more than once, they're going through the questions that I asked, they're choosing different kinds of options because they want to learn more. So the one thing I wanted to kind of pre-frame here is that questions, and anything really driven by questions, is actually really fun. Now, obviously, you don't want to overdo this where everything you do is a question, which makes it almost exhausting. But the reason questions are fun, and it's because guess what? If I ask you a question, or we ask anybody a question, usually the mind immediately tries to solve it. We are problem-solving creatures, so using questions is a very good strategy. To prove my point, I will ask you a question right now. Why are cucumbers green? Now, some of you, even if you didn't know, you started thinking about this, right? You started thinking about reasons why, or some sort of proof, or you knew it in your mind and you knew exactly why, right? But what happens is when you ask a question, because of the way our minds work, we are going to try to solve it. So these creating compelling and meaningful questions is, in fact, a very powerful way to engage people and to help them learn. Now, if we were all, growing vegetables and I asked you why cucumbers are green, that would even make it more compelling, because you want to make the question that you're asking mean something to the person that's answering it, especially if it's a question that maybe they have thought about before, or they see themselves answering that question or coming up with a reason to answer that question on the job. So what I do every day, believe it or not, is I think about what makes scenarios awesome, why some work better than others, and how can I help you understand some tips and tricks and strategies that can actually make your life easier so that you can use this strategy more effectively and efficiently in your life. Because let me tell you the truth, there are a lot of people who are really good at organizing content. They're really good at formatting it, making it look cool, but there are very few people who spend the time actually putting together really good questions. And I want to help you get better at this, because this will take you to the next level. The design of really good questions, and then testing those questions to see if they're compelling enough that people want to answer them, right? It's huge for us. And I have to tell you, if you're just getting started with scenarios, if you focus on just creating compelling multiple choice questions alone, 95% of the work you do will be dedicated to this, or can be framed around this pattern of the multiple choice question. And I've worked with top universities, and I've worked with huge multinationals. The pattern and the framework does not change, which is absolutely amazing news for us, because you get good at this, boom, this is like 95% of your work done. Okay, hopefully you're like, woo, I'm so excited. Okay, bring it on, Anna. Bring on the great news. Okay, so first, you probably are familiar with the multiple choice question. You've probably had it on a test sometime, right? Now, the multiple choice question is where you have a question posed to you, and you have A, B, C posed as your options, and you choose one of them. In a multiple choice question, only one of the options is valid. So let's just get the terminology out of the way. So the pieces of a multiple choice question, and I'm talking about the pieces of a multiple choice question in the context of a scenario, which is a little bit different, and I'll show you how that works a little later on, is this. So there's the stem, and the stem is that first part that identifies the question. It basically gives us a situation, and we're supposed to make some sort of a decision. Then there's the correct or the best option. In some multiple choice questions, you can actually have all of the answers be A, B, C, all be credible, but you're choosing the best answer. So that's one way of looking at that. So in addition to the correct option or the best option, you also have mostly two alternate options. Those alternate wrong options are actually called the distractors. So what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to distract you from the best option. And there is actually a very specific strategy around how you come up with the distractors and their purpose in a scenario designed multiple choice question. Now, usually what happens in a traditional question is you have feedback, right? So if you choose A in a good question, if you choose A, there will be feedback saying, correct, you got it, this is the right way to approach this. Now, in a scenario designed question, there is feedback. However, we don't give the feedback as soon as a person chooses their option. We give the feedback after they've experienced the consequence. Now, what is the consequence? The consequence is what would happen in quote unquote reality if I chose a certain course of action. So if you have a question, then you have a bunch of options and I choose option A, then the consequence would be what would happen in the real world. Let's say as a result of me making that decision, okay, I think about that a bit. Is that a good outcome or a bad outcome? And then we get to the feedback, which then could be either a link to more information to learn about this particular aspect of that situation, or like an excerpt of the procedure. But whatever it is, it's not. It gives the learner a chance to discover maybe there's a gap in their thinking because they thought decision B was clearly the right answer. Then they get the consequence, and it's like, you end up burning yourself on the stove. You're like, ooh, that wasn't a good idea. Maybe I don't know everything I thought I knew about this. Now when you give them that information, it's actually useful. And so that's one of the things I love to advise my students and the people I consult with, is that even if you have a huge manual, to front load that information and give it to somebody up front, they really don't know when they're supposed to use it. And also they're remembering everything kind of like everything is equally as important when you give somebody a binder, right? Or you give them a giant presentation, or you give them 4 hours of video to watch. Everything is just extremely either extremely important, but then what happens is as you watch, let's say, 30 minutes of somebody talking about something, if you don't know when you're going to use all of the things that they're telling you about, if you don't know when you're going to use it, for efficiency's sake, you just stop remembering it completely because you have nothing to attach it to, right? You're trying to make all the pieces of learning, and that's what the STEM does. The STEM kind of helps you attach that situation to either a story or something that's going to happen in that person's life later on, and then they can kind of attach it to what they already know about their workplace. They're attaching this situation to that. You're kind of that's the point, you're making that connection with that STEM. And then those options, now they seem, a little more credible because the context of the STEM is helpful or interesting or provocative or whatever. And then now the options are things that I would think about doing because I understand that situation. So when you, at the end, give me, in the feedback, you give me maybe additional resources or something that I should read about, now I'm interested in it because it has a connection to the situation that I would use it in. So that's why that's really helpful to do there. So let me just give you a little bit more context around the multiple choice question here. And so remember I talked about the question pieces being the STEM, which is that setup. Then there's the best option and choice, and then there's the distractors. And this is what this is an excerpt from Thomas M. Haladina text, which is dedicated especially to developing and validating multiple choice test items. But this is what he has to say about distractors, or those impossible options, or those options that are not supposed to be the best choice. So here I'm reading from the book right now. Distractors are the most difficult part of the test item to write. A distractor is an unquestionably wrong answer. Each distractor must be plausible to test takers who have not yet learned the knowledge or skill that the test item is supposed to measure. So what he means there is that we cannot take our distractors lightly because your distractors are actually serving a purpose. They're identifying pieces they're identifying mistakes that people make on the job. So to somebody who's new or who hasn't learned this yet, those distractors won't be easy to spot because distractors are based on behavior that somebody who's not doing this well is actually performing. So returning back to the book. To those people who possess the knowledge asked for in the item, so in the question, the distractors are clearly wrong choices. Each distractor should resemble the correct choice in grammatical form, style, and length. Subtle or blatant cues that give away the correct choice should always be avoided. So one of the things that I suggest here is sometimes what happens is when you're writing a multiple choice question, the right answer, this sometimes happens, you've probably seen this, is usually the wordiest one, the one with the most detail. And so that makes it a clear giveaway that that's the right answer. So you want to avoid that. You want to make them all look equally valid and when I say valid, what I mean is that you won't have one super long answer and two short ones, and you're like, yeah, obviously it's this one because it's the longest and most detailed. So what you can do is actually, instead of making those distractors and the option writing out the whole thing, you could actually first make each one of those a certain type of, like, shorten the description of it. So you could say, let's say the answer is how are you supposed to make sure that a car is safely parked? And then you could have a whole bunch of things that would be a part of that, right? Or you could actually focus on shortening that to a single decision. So instead of writing all of those things out and making it very evident that it is exactly, A with all the details, that is the correct answer, what you can do is say, secure the car and make sure that it is stationary. And B could be, make sure you're parked on a quiet street, right? So what happens is then you're actually distilling the key actions to a single sentence, let's say, and then the person is making their decision based on these summarized versions of the action to be taken. So it could be like, let's say somebody comes in with it's a sales or a customer service scenario, and a customer has been very rude to you. What do you do? So option A could be acknowledge the customer's mood, and then make sure that you find out if it's actually the product or if it's something else going on, but acknowledge and listen, la 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 la. And then option 2, which maybe a lot of people, maybe the error that they make in customer service is that they take it personally, and what they do is, instead of trying to resolve the issue, maybe they go straight to their manager. So your options could be, because I'm trying to summarize those things, is the first option A could be empathize with customer. Option B would be seek manager help. So see what I'm doing there is I'm taking something that you could later show them the full action, but right now I'm trying to focus on maybe having them make a decision based on these kinds of summarized action types, and then I can actually show them the full thing once they've actually selected it. So I'm trying to make them all seem equally credible and equally correct. So for somebody who's very new and maybe doesn't want to deal with the customer, they might choose option B because it looks just as credible as option 1, which is empathize with the customer. So I hope that is clear. Now, so distractors are quite, not only are they difficult to write, because you cannot write a distractor if you're not the subject matter expert. That's why we need subject matter experts. We need their brains, we need their stories, because the correct answer, you can always find that. You can find that in a manual. It doesn't tell you where people mess up. It doesn't tell you what things people need to think about to what they need to think about to execute the action properly. And also, it doesn't tell you what people think about to actually mess it up. So that's what your distractors are for. That's why the reason they're the hardest to write is because we usually try to come up with them on our own. No. Talk to your subject matter expert. And the one thing that's fantastic about having a real template, which is just a simple multiple choice question, which is you have a STEM, 3 options, and also consequences that are linked to each of those options, and then your feedback, is when you're now talking to a SME, you don't have to start with a blank page saying, we're just going to do something. They don't even have to know. All you have to do is now say, okay, give me a situation and let's talk about what's the best way to address the situation. Now, where do people mess up? What are some things they're thinking or doing that aren't helping? And those end up being your distractors, because the other thing I was thinking is that we don't need to go further than 3 options, a best choice and 2 alternatives. And this is actually supported by research. So the number of distractors that are needed for the conventional multiple choice question is, when after it was analyzed, 3 options, a right answer and 2 distractors, is actually very natural for people. And there's actually very few decisions in the world when you see the kinds of scenarios that we design. Very few actually have more than 2 working distractors. So most of the examples even that you'll see out there, they have 3 options, because both theory and research suggest that this actually works really well. So stick to that. Don't break the pattern. It actually works. So the other thing, which is actually quite awesome, is that when you look at the different types of skills or skill types that you'd like to be able to evaluate with scenarios or help people practice, because, why are you asking these questions? The questions are being asked for 2 reasons. 1, to help people practice something in a safe place. And I'm just oversimplifying this, right? But the other reason you're asking these questions is because scenarios serve as a form of assessment. So this is a way for somebody to prove to you that they've mastered or they can demonstrate competence in this area. And so what is actually super fantastic is that if most of the skills out there, except for things like let's say skills like remembering ideas and facts, easy to check with multiple choice questions, right? And this is like conceptual and factual knowledge. Easy to test with multiple choice questions if they're phrased right. And like our skills, our scenarios can go all the way to measuring how people do well in interpersonal skills and negotiation. And those things are they are harder to measure with multiple choice questions because you actually need a human component. But let me tell you, 95% of the skills that we measure that can be effectively done and evaluated can be done with multiple choice questions. Woo! So, I want you to forget everything else for now and just actually start getting awesome at designing powerful, compelling multiple choice questions with rock solid consequences. And you will take your scenario design to the next level. You just have to start. One of the things that we do is we distract ourselves looking at all these other things. That there's all these little details that distract us from the fact that the pattern, the multiple choice question pattern, is underneath 99% of the pieces out there. So if you start with that, you let go of all the bling that's out there and the click and reveals and all those other things. Just let go of that and start with your pattern of a simple multiple choice question template with consequences and feedback, you can now focus on the language, the questions, and the kinds of conversations you need to have with the subject matter experts to help you fill in that template. You're no longer starting with a blank slate. And I gotta tell you, if your next scenario is simply a compilation of a multiple choice question with consequence, multiple question with consequence, if you string that together, but you've researched it, you've talked to the right people, you've tested it, the language is great, it's tight, your consequences are good, boom. You're a rock star. That's all it takes. Seriously. All right. So, I think that what we have to start thinking about is to reduce any overwhelm or anxiety around how I'm going to, get this project done or started. Start with those questions. You're not trying to teach people public speaking skills, right? There are many, many, many skills before that you can address by crafting awesome questions. So, one of the things that I really want to just draw your attention to is that the question, that stem, that setup, it needs to be provocative. It needs to be interesting and very contextual. And when I say contextual, it means that the learner finds it not only interesting to answer, it's a good challenge, it's a great question. And what makes a good question for somebody is that they can see themselves actually having this come up or be asked this on the job. So that would include that they have to either solve a problem based on some information and data that's presented to them in this scenario question, or they have to make a decision based on certain criteria, right? That makes an interesting question. It's not just, why is the cucumber green? Even though you're already, you thought about that. It's like, who cares, right? I mean, just eat it or not. So let's say this is an example for a question for salespeople who are, let's say, trying to sell an iPhone. And a question could be, which feature helps the user transfer files between their smartphone and their laptop? Really, there's several things that are wrong with this, right? Nobody is ever going to come up to you as a salesperson and no customer is ever going to go, hey, what's the feature that helps me transfer files between a smartphone and the laptop? Maybe 1 in a million. Most people come in with problems, right? And the other thing is that this is not really conducive to a decision, because identifying a feature, you might identify the wrong feature and then somebody might just correct you and be like, yeah, I don't think that's it. That's not really compelling. So you want to make it juicy, sexy. You want to make it grounded in reality. Like when would this actually come up? Because one of the things you might want to reinforce, as I've worked with tons of salespeople, is what you want to reinforce is that idea that they're listening to the customer so they can figure out how the things that the customer is struggling with, how can you find a product that will actually help them solve their problem, right? So the feature, which in this case is AirDrop, right? Being able to transfer stuff from your phone to your Mac, let's say, is very helpful. That doesn't diminish the feature, but the way that we wrap it and why in the world would anybody ever want to bring that up is totally different, right? So you would take that stem and revisit it and think, when is this ever going to come up that, people aren't identifying? We realize that people don't know how to connect an actual feature of a product. They don't know how to connect it to a benefit or a problem that the customer has. So how do we do that? So what's a problem? Here's a problem. A customer says she hates using her phone camera, and she says, I continue to use my regular camera because it has a plug-in cable, because I hate having to send every picture to myself via email. Like, that's so annoying because I want to edit them before I post them to Facebook, but I can't do that. It's just tedious for me to email myself every picture that I want to edit. That's why I just take all my pictures on my regular camera, plug it in, everything gets loaded into Photos. What do you suggest? Right? So you could say, okay, here's a customer comes in with like a regular issue. What would you suggest they use? And then you could list a bunch of features and also attach to them the benefit and say, well, she could use cable because blah, blah, blah. So you're really trying to contextualize that question and make it compelling for somebody to actually want to answer. And then you can have a string of questions because all of them are asking the learner to kind of go back into their own idea of what they already know about this topic and make them challenge themselves to say, I think I do know what the answer is. And if it's not what they thought, then this is also a great way for them to discover that. And that's where your consequences and then the resulting feedback will come in. So let's just talk about the distractors a little bit very quickly. So they're the hardest to create, but in fact, they are identifying and addressing the most common mistakes made. They are just as important, if not more important, than actually the correct choice. Because in some ways, if you actually think about it, the distractors are the reason this training was designed, because these are the mistakes that people are making in the first place, right? So you have to make sure they're structured and said in the right way. So the mistakes or distractors can be identifying that there's a faulty process, like that the learner follows a faulty process. Like they make a decision, like they react too quickly instead of actually looking at procedures. Or they rely on their memory to answer a question when that information changes constantly, right? Or a faulty mindset. Like one of the things could be that the distractor could say, why would it matter to me? Like you notice there's or John notices there's a plug that's hanging off the wall, and you can see the inside of the wall in the men's bathroom, and it's just hanging there. And I mean, he works in the HR department, and this is the men's washroom for their headquarters. But he thinks, obviously somebody's going to notice that and fix it. One of the options is, why would it matter for me to speak up about a broken outlet in the men's bathroom? But maybe the reason you want to reinforce that and actually bring up that distractor is because a lot of, let's say, staff feel apathetic about, if they feel apathetic about their environment, they might feel apathetic about other things that need fixing. And so you're trying to reinforce the idea that, hey, these are things that need to be addressed because they percolate into everything else that everybody else does in this company. And even a broken wall outlet can contribute to a certain type of mindset. So, feedback and consequences. Consequences always come before feedback. Don't mix these up. Example, this statement. I do something, I choose an option. That's not the best way to do that, is it? This is feedback. I choose an option and this is what I get. The customer suddenly stopped talking, said thank you, and left the store. One of these decides the outcome, and the other one pretends to be some kind of mom, telling me how to think about what I did without letting me experience it first. So let me experience the outcome first. Don't tell me anything about whether it's wrong or right. Just show me what happens when I choose B. Customer stops talking, says thank you, and leaves the store. That might actually be a good outcome, right? But that's for me to decide. That's for me to decide as a learner and draw my own conclusions. If you make the consequences blatant, compelling, and interesting enough, that might just be enough. I may not need feedback, and the feedback might be, superfluous. But if feedback is necessary in corrective action, like I said, feedback is where you can put more info. Hey, you didn't get that right, did you? That wasn't a really good way to handle that because that lady just stormed off. She's never coming back again. Maybe you should check out this procedure on how to diffuse a angry situation. There you go. Boom, right? So, let me wrap this up by just summarizing the key ideas for this. A well-designed multiple choice question, which includes compelling, contextual STEM, is awesome. It also needs to include good, challenging distractors that a novice would find just equally compelling as the right answer. They all kind of need to look like each of them are very much on equal ground as far as validity. The consequences should be beefed up to help the learner draw their own conclusions. So think of the worst case scenario, put it in there. Why not? Be blatant. This is the place to be blatant. This is the place to make people die in the consequences, because you're trying to prevent people dying in real life. So don't be afraid to make the consequences extra compelling, serious. I'm not talking about making them ridiculous. I'm talking about worst case scenario. That's what you need to do, because you're trying to help people have better outcomes, right? And the most awesome, fabulous thing is that these multiple choice questions can be used in 95% of the scenario design and effective assessment design. They can be repurposed many times over. If you want to do assessments later on, heck, use the same questions, remove the consequences, you've got an awesome multiple choice test. Done, right? Okay, so I am so glad you took the time to listen to this, because I think this will take your scenario design to the next level. Apply these, use them, do not question it, just get good at designing these questions, because these are the framework that will take you to the next level when you're designing e-learning scenarios. All right, so have a fabulous day. Let me know if you have any other questions, any other concepts that you found you wanted me to dig into a bit more. And I hope you have an awesome rest of the day. See you next time, or hear you next time. My dear friend, take care. Bye.
You're listening to the eLearning Scenario Design Podcast with Anna Sabramowitz.